Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk with this distinguished group. Now, I've worked with journalists in my previous assignment in Beijing for the Brookings, so I know everyone has his or her own interests, background, agenda, and when I was preparing for this was not very straightforward. Was a little challenging. So what I told Sandra was, I have a script here, but I'm happy to go to other directions to the extent I can. So when Fudan brought up this group's visit, I gave them a title which I used to focus on, which is called China After the One-Child Policy. And I thought that's one of the basic parameters of looking at China right now. And also that's the area I've done a lot of research and policy advocacy here in China and overseas. But then Fudan's Foreign Affairs Office came back and said, oh, could you talk about economics and social change? So I think that's probably the title there, so I made some change here. I will still focus on what I know better, which is demographics. And I can promise you it's not boring. And demography is boring in general. But I would place this within what we call the China's new normal. You perhaps are already tired with this story of China's success. Everybody talks about how history is being made, and it is true. I think Larry Summers put this in the best summary, that in the last millennium, there were three important things for the whole world. It was the Renaissance, it was the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of China. I think that's, in many ways, that's a fair summary. But as you have come to see, China's success came to many people's surprise. I've studied, I was born and brought up in China, studied abroad in the US, and I've done studies in the last 20, 30 years. I must say, even as recent as 15 years ago, or less than 15 years ago, in 2001, when China entered WTO, very few, if anyone, in the world, including those in China, including those who sit in the center of Beijing, thought China would be like it today. So the economic boom in the last 10 plus years, really exceeded, I think, everyone's expectation. The rise of China has been talked about for over a century, a couple of centuries. But what happened in the last decade really came as a surprise. So we're still trying to understand how this has happened, and a related question is where China is going. So one thing we know for sure is that China in the last 15 years, last 30 years, last 150 years, has been trying to catch up to the rest of the world. And in that process, what I would say is China has heavily mortgaged its future. You've had a conversation on the environment, right? We're very happy with what China just did a couple of days ago in Beijing. I think it's tremendously important, but you may also have noticed how little reporting it has received within China, right? The significance of this historical breakthrough. So China has paid, or today is actually a rare but a good reminder. I mean, the air outside is pretty bad. Sylvia here, our research assistant in the school, had to go back to her apartment to get a face mask before coming out here. And in Beijing, with the exception of the APEC Blue, pollution was a serious problem. We don't actually fully understand the consequences of such severe pollution to people's health. That would wait for.
Why doesn't it get more coverage? Why would that accord not have gotten more coverage?
I would blame I think both. It's interesting. I would first blame the Chinese official media because what's been reported. It's still, especially in the major news media, is still very carefully choreographed. Right. So the fact that it was reported but not as a huge success, like the Olympics, like the APEC, the party propaganda department is responsible. But also, what I'm surprised is the public awareness. I think this would come back to demographics as well. Is how little people know about global climate change, and how little people pay attention to this. Because I also watch the private, the non-official media. It's not a huge deal in that sphere as well. So it's really, I think, both the society and the government. So China has heavily mortgaged its environment. China has mortgaged on political legitimacy in terms of corruption, right? Now it's coming back to a crackdown on corruption. China has mortgaged on inequality. I would say in no other place China has mortgaged more heavily than in its population. Right. So that's what I want to get to for today. It's the changing demographic landscape and how what that means possibly with a lot of issues we talk about from now on, including China's march toward a high-income society, moving out of this so-called feared middle-income trap, including China's political viability, how the government would be able to manage a serious aging issue, and healthcare, all the challenges posed by the changing demographics. So I would focus on demographics and address a number of issues. Here, I think one can really think of the parallel between environment and population. A group of colleagues here, we started in Fudan 13 years ago in 2001 to carry out systematic studies to bring to the policymakers' attention of the problems associated with China's one-child policy. And for the longest time, I think it's very much like environment. Both the leaders in Beijing and the public did not feel that this was something that's urgent. People tend to say, "Oh, China just has too many people," right? So that actually, I think, environment would come back. But the one good thing, I'll finish that, I'll move on, is that the pollution has really picked up the best place. It happens in Beijing, and people feel they can sense how bad the air is, and that actually helps with climate change, right? And at least from that perspective, the leaders in Beijing need to do something. They feel they can get public support. There's much talk about China's new normal. The Chinese leaders have seized upon this terminology as well. One is China is now a middle-income society. So regardless of what I say, after this, China has moved up to a much higher platform. So anything that China does from now on, we're not talking about getting out of poverty. We're really talking about living on a material, in terms of material comfort. It's a middle-income society. In places like Shanghai, I think rival many most developed parts of the world. Right? China has tremendous inequality. You still have places that are very poor, But overall, China is now operating on a middle-income society basis. It's actually by the World Bank standard, China is now upper middle-income society. And its economy is going to continue to grow, but not as much as some people believe, and I will get to this point. But also China is dealing with the demand and the expectation of the population from a middle-income society, right? A middle, ever growing middle class. So that is the new normal we're looking at. But the new normal is also an era where the double-digit economic growth cannot be sustained. I'll explain why. I think you may not need to be convinced by looking at the history, but I think demographics plays a important role here. And the third fact of new normal in China is becoming a rapidly aging society. China now has over 300 million people aged 60 and over, and within a few years, the size of China's elderly will surpass the total population of the United States. Now, everything in China is large, so the size itself may not matter that much, but when you're looking at 25 to 35% of the population will be in that age group, and that could have serious implications. Right? So here is a graph. I don't know whether you've already seen. It shows the change in economic growth rate, and the top line is on different scale, is the government revenue increase rate. Now, if you look at the economic growth rate is pretty much 10% or slightly more than 10%. It's on the left axis, is the lower line. But what's important is the top line, is the government revenue increase speed. For much of the last decade and more, the growth rate of government revenue was at about twice the rate of economic growth, so nearly 20%. The recent exception is what happened in the last 3 years. So when economic growth rate drops from 10 to 7 to 8, we're talking about 20-30% drop. The government revenue, the increase rate drops by 50%, from 20 to 10%. That's the top line near the end. You see it's from 20 to about less than 10% now. Okay.
This is probably a very dumb question, but what are the main sources of revenue for the government, and why did they shift that much?
It's mostly the profits from the state-owned enterprises, taxes, but mostly in consumption taxes, right? And land revenue, selling land, local government selling land. So there are many sources, but what this says, it's like the U.S. Taxpayers, your income tax rate is when your income really goes to a very high level, the government takes a larger share as well. It's the marginal tax. So what I'm saying here is the implications of the economic slowdown is not just for the whole society, but also for the government. And later on, I'm going to get into the issues of healthcare, into pension reforms, and again, these are, we're talking about middle income society. People expect these things to happen, right? So when you have a government that's been in the driver's seat for so long and has promised so much, if economic slowdown further affects government revenue, if the government cannot deliver what it promised to do, and this affects the political legitimacy of the government. That is why if you look at decision makers in Beijing, they are really of two minds. One is saying we really should not artificially pump up the economy because it really comes back to haunt us. But at the same time, in the last month, the State Council had 7 meetings or 5 meetings, all on stimulating the economy. Right. So this is what we're going to see for the time to come. Anyway, so this is what we call the new normal. Now let me get quickly into the demographics. This is there are many reasons for China's economic boom, and very quickly, one of them is clearly the role played by demographics. This is what you see as the age structure plotted as lines for 1982. That's the blue line with the arrow. And then is 2000 and 2050 projected. So back in 1982, when China's one-child policy was launched, the bulk of China's population was in the around teenage ages, right? And when the boom occurred around 2000, the bulge conveniently moved into primary working age, right? Of course, just like the U.S. baby boom, you're going to see this bulge to move forward. So by 2050, they will be mostly in the old age group. So in other words, what we're looking at, this is not a time to discuss how China became what it is today. It's way too complicated for me. But clearly we saw 2 booms coinciding at the same time, the demographic young labor boom and China's economic growth boom. So that boom is coming to an end. Now this is the work done by Andy Mason at the East-West Center in Hawaii. Yes?
Are you saying that the influx of 20-something workers helped create the boom?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah, cheap labor, right? Abundant cheap labor, who built the high-speed railroads, airports, skyscrapers, train stations, whatever you've seen. The hard infrastructure, a lot of hardworking and lowly paid workers. Now, this is a little more technical. They plot basically 2 lines, the growth rate of 2 lines, the producers versus consumers. Everyone is a consumer. Now, these numbers are weighted by income when they talk about producer, and weighted by the level of consumption when we calculate consumers. So what we're seeing is before the year 2000, the growth rate of producers was much faster than the growth rate of consumers. Right? These are growth rates. And during the period after year 2000 to the year just passed, 2013, the 2 rates started to converge. And in last year, 2013, there was a crossover. So the growth rate for the consumers is now faster than the growth rate of producers. Now, in economics jargon, this is called the end of the demographic dividend. So when you have a growth rate that's faster than of producers, faster than consumers, there is a positive demographic dividend. Now, various people have calculated what was the contribution of China's favorable age structure to its economic growth. The World Bank's data is about 25%. Now, Andy Mason and my own calculation is about 15% prior to year 2000. So the World Bank gave an annual growth rate average about 8.5% prior to year 2000. And out of that, about 15% was due to the demographic age structure. Okay, but that has come to an end now. When you look at the age pyramid, this is more than evident. The top left is 1982. China's population looked like a pyramid. And top right is what it is roughly now from the 2010 census. You still have a big bulge in the middle. And by 2040, in 25 years, China's population age structure would look something like a chimney, right? And it's going to get even more top heavy. So, in terms of growth rate and birth, in recent this is the my apple. This is what happened. The bottom is year, and the vertical axis is number. Wow. I can't tell. But what this says is basically from the peak in the late 1980s to now, the annual number of births now is 10 million less than what it was back in 1987. So China had close to 30 million births then, now it's about 16 million. Okay, more than. In the 1990s, 60% of Chinese elementary schools were closed down. But still, 10 years ago, when we called the government to relax the one-child policy, nobody would listen. No, so there is a now the growth rate now is still positive, but it's only a third of what it was in the late 1980s. And in about 10 years, China would turn to population decline, following Russia, Japan, Germany. And it's not going to be reversible for a short time period. So there's much talk about China moving into the middle income society, to move into a high level, about China's economic growth after middle income level. And one way people have phrased this is to define, there are many ways to define middle income. One way is to define middle income as 1/5 of per capita income of the US. Okay, so when the country reached 1/5 of US per capita income level. Now for China, that happened in 2006. For Japan, that happened in 1955. For Taiwan, it was 1975. And for South Korea, was 1980. Now, based on the experience of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, some prominent economists in China believe that China should have another 20 years of growth, because that's what happened with these three economies. I don't know whether you've heard of, China would have 80% growth rate for another 20 years. Has anyone heard of it? Yeah. So this is the basis of that argument, right? However, I would say, there are important underlying forces and parameters that are quite different in China than in the other economies during the early time period. And chief among them is China's aging, population aging. Now this is hard to read. This is the growth rate after reaching 20% of the US level. And so basically the other countries or continue to grow. So we don't know, at the end it's China. So let me move on to easier ones. We'll have clearer figures. So looking ahead, we're looking at the population aging level. Now for Japan, for Taiwan, for South Korea, when they reached 1/5 of the US income level, that is the middle income by this standard, this is the level of their population aging. It's the share of the population aged 65 and over. So in Japan, it's about 5%, and Korea, South Korea, and Taiwan less than 4%. For China, back in 2006, it's already 8%. Okay, so it's much higher. So in other words, if you are, okay, again, I'm sorry for the axis, the labels. It's the year at the bottom, and the vertical axis is population aging level, 65 and over. So what we're plotting is, for the other three economies, it took them 20 years for the population aging to reach what China's aging level is about right now. So in other words, what China begins with population aging, is what the other three societies who caught up with the U.S., caught up to moved out of the middle income status. It took them 20 years to reach that level. So we're starting at a very different demographic starting lines. The question follows is, why would demographics matter? This is Taiwan's growth after they've reached the aging level reached. This one actually is clear, about 80%. Right? You look at the red line is population aging, and the blue line is economic growth rate. This is for Taiwan, and this is for Japan. Again, the red line is population aging, and this is South Korea. We have a shorter time period. So if I put those three economies together, after their population aging level reached China's current level, 9%, the average economic growth rate was about 3%. Now this is way too simple a causation. You would say, well, economy depends on many factors. You can't say when the aging population aging reaches a certain level, you have to have a slower economic growth rate. So why would aging matter, right? Well, we can think of at least the following areas: labor force growth. We can look at the consumer market, right? Whether people consume or not, or what do they consume. We look at savings, whether it's putting money more into savings or start to use savings. And we can look at public spending, whether money is going to be used for investment or for social welfare spending. And we can look at the degree of technological innovation in the population. Right? So I don't have too many slides or statistics on each of them, but I can share a few of them, and then we can get into more discussions. This is what happens with labor in China. The overall labor force is still growing for a few more years, but the young labor supply already reached the peak, and it's going to go down by a third in the next 2 decades. So we're really looking at the shrinking of young labor force. We're looking at aging. China, together with South Korea, Taiwan, are among the fastest aging societies in the world. Now, the numbers on this chart are the years it took for population age 65 and over to go from 9% to 25%. Okay. 9% is China's current level, a couple of years ago actually. 25% is pretty severe aging. So here you're looking at Russia. It's a very old society now. It's 80 years. And for others, it's mostly 70, 80 years to 100 years and more. But for these East Asian societies, we're looking at 30-some years. Now for China, it's going to be 28 years. So the pace of aging is certainly very fast. And there's much talk about old before rich. So this is the comparison of the income level when China and other East Asian societies reached China's aging level back in, I think, 2000 or 2010. So China is about half of what Japan had, and less than half of what Taiwan, and not much more than a third than South Korea, when the other societies reached the high aging level. Okay, now this actually is the most important, I think, revealing figure that I want to share with you. Again, unfortunately, the axes are not showing up. It's because of I was done on Apple, and this is a PC. But what shows is at the bottom is the horizontal axis is year, from year 2000, I think, to 2030, and the vertical axis, or these lines, mean is the ratio between working population ages 60 and over, and it's the number of working persons aged 20 to 59 to those aged 60 and over. So you can think of this as taxpayers versus tax receivers, right? Now, back in 2000, China had a ratio of about 5 to 1. I think if you need to think of two numbers, and these are two numbers to take with you, that is, back in 2000, the ratio between tax-paying working population and tax-receiving old population was 5 to 1. In 16 years, by 2030, and that ratio drops to 2 to 1. So think of any society in the world that can figure out an easy way out of this. Whether you decrease benefits or you increase tax burden, or you do both, right? I mean, coming from the United States has a far, far better demographic profile. And we talk about what a crisis we may get into all the time. Now, this is crisis. Now, the top one is India. This is with BRIC countries. And the bottom one is Russia. And I believe South Africa is, Brazil is the blue line that's above China. So these are the BRIC countries.
Professor Wang, we
Yes.
think that when we publish these slides on Marina's Apple computer, they'll turn out fine for the journalists.
Yeah, right. You should. I don't know. This has happened more than once. Yeah. Forgot about this. Sorry about this. So 5 to 1 to 2 to 1. So that's, in 30 years. So that's what China faces. The aging in China comes with a special cost, and that is the number of Chinese families with only one child. This is a provincial distribution of women back in 2005, age 35 and to 49, which means that these women have done with their childbearing, and the share of them with only one child. Now, this is for urban China, so it's 2/3 of urban Chinese families have only one child. Right. So on top of the aggregate declining ratio of support, we have a special situation in part created by the one-child policy. Okay. Now this is the proportion of the population based on their main source of income comes from pension. Again, sorry for this. Now the bottom line is for women, and the top line is for men, and each scale is 5%. So for women, this is from 2010 China's recent census. So for women here, I believe the starting age is 55. So roughly 20% of Chinese women now in their young old age rely on pension as their main income. For men, it's about 30%. So this is where people draw their income currently. Mainly, these are the urban people, right? So we're looking at 80% of women and 70% of men who do not have pension income in China. So this is a picture. Okay, good. This works. In part because of the improvement in health, and in part because of the change in age structure, we're seeing a distinct change in the profile of cause of death. Back in 1990, what we call the NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, that's cancer, the middle one, the cancer, cerebrovascular and cardiovascular diseases, they accounted for about 50% of all causes of death, right? Now, in 2011, the share increased to, 70%. So 70% of all causes, all death now, are due to these non-communicable diseases. Now, the World Bank actually gave a higher number. It's like something like 80%. Now, these are from the Chinese health statistics. So when you have 70 to 80% of a large number of deaths are from these causes, they are more costly to care for. They last for a much longer time, right? And so the changing causes of death have tremendous implications for healthcare cost for China, right?
Do people forecast, because of pollution and because there are so many carcinogens in the air, what that might mean going forward? Is there planning for that going forward?
There are people who are doing this, and last year there was a sensational report saying how people in North China, I think North China, South China, lived 5 years shorter because of air pollution. This was done by a guy at MIT and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. It got published, I think, in National Academy proceedings. It got a lot of publicity, but it's not something that's easy to model. People know there is a role, but to what extent, I think the specialists in those areas are, I think, working on that. But it's hard to forecast.
Sure.
Yeah, it's hard to forecast. But this is reality now, right? So when you look at the NCDs as cause of death going from 50% to 70%. Remember, China has a huge number of deaths, and the number of deaths is going to increase because of the larger population and also because of aging. So, this is not a trivial change, right? People talk about the diabetes epidemic, right? And other numbers we actually know better. China has 20% of the world population, but 40% of the world smokers, right? That could certainly have implications for lung cancer. So aging is not just having more elderly people, right? It relates to the economy, to healthcare, to public spending, and to political legitimacy. I thought I want to end the introduction with some positive notes, cautiously positive notes. One is people are talking about the sources of China's the next phase of growth. Urbanization has been one that you probably already heard about. Here, these are three different measures of urbanization. Okay, The middle one, the blue line, is the one that's the official number for percentage of people living in urban areas, and that's over 50%. That's China's one measure of urbanization. Now there are two other measures I also put on this map, on this graph. The top one is labor force participation in non-agriculture sectors, and that already reached over 70%. So in other words, China does not have another 50% people 50% of its population to move into the cities, especially among young people, right? You don't see many young people in the countryside anymore. The bottom line is especially troubling, and that is the share of the urban population by the definition of their household registration status. That's the hukou status, and that number is 36%.
What's the status again by the share of their?
By the share, it's their household registration status, whether they are a non-agricultural or urban person or they are a rural person.
Does that mean that 36% of urban Chinese are registered as rural Chinese? Is that what you said?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't quite translate into that. So what? Okay, so the difference between the middle line and the bottom line. So the middle line says over 50% of China's population are urban now. Mm-hmm. They live in urban areas. The bottom line says 34%. That's 36. 34% actually have urban, the non-agricultural household status, registration status.
So
they are entitled to benefits in the cities. So the difference between the two, 20%, is about 200 million. So that's the people, that's the Chinese migrants who are already in the cities who have not been digested. So China does not have, well, China certainly still has room for urbanization, but it does not have one urbanization. It has at least three, right? So in terms of labor supply, it does not have as many as new, fresh labor supply from the countryside. But at the same time, the primary task for Chinese urbanization is actually how to absorb the people who are currently already in the cities, but they do not have the status as the locals.
What do they need to get that status? How do they do that?
This year, actually last year, this year, China has seen a lot of major reforms. Last year, I think 2 measures on population policy. First, closing down the State Population and Family Planning Commission, and then announcing the partial relaxation of the one-child policy in November a year ago. This marked the beginning of reforms in birth control policy. And this year, just a couple of months ago, in the summer, China announced a new set of reforms aimed at ending this dual kind of citizenship within the same country. But it's the same problem as really the unauthorized immigrants in the United States. It's almost exactly parallel, right? So it's not an issue to say, okay, we gave you a citizenship paper. I think in the U.S. that would bring down some barriers. But in the Chinese case, it's really how do you get into housing? How do you get into the same jobs? Now, healthcare, pension, and China has what called a minimum livelihood guarantee program, which has a very different standard for urban and rural people, right? So a place like Shanghai, that actually, even with the latest reform, is left out of the picture. You still need, the big cities still need to be controlled. So if you live in Shanghai, the majority, a lot of Chinese, I think 40% or more than 40% migrants are in big cities. And they would have to wait. So it's not just we say, okay, now we change your registration. It's how do you get the benefits others already have? The government does not have the money to give everyone the same. It's just simply not possible. So here we are looking at a new source of growth, but there are underlying complexities. Okay. Now the last one I think is truly promising. This is the change in. Okay, this is clear. Right, this is clear. So it's all there. So it's the share of the population with college education in 1990, 2000, and 2010. Look at age group 21 to 26, the second cluster. 20 years ago was 3%. Now it's, what is that? 24, it's a quarter. 8-fold increase. And look at 26 to 30, you see roughly the same kind of growth. Now, there are many concerns with aging, with economic slowdown, but this is what we look at as a source of continued economic growth. It's really China has. I think people have not probably paid enough attention. People look at high rises, high-speed railroads, airports, but China has also invested heavily in educational institutions and drastically increased the enrollment of higher education institutions in the first decade of 21st century alone. There was a 3-fold increase in enrollment capacity from 2 million to 6 million. And that is, I think, equally historical. Let me just end here. I know this looks like a collection of somewhat loosely connected facts, but I hope they all address to 2 issues. One is the profound change in demographics in China, and the potential, the long-term challenges. And the other is really with the different aspects of China's economy and with Chinese society. So I hope with this I can satisfy some portion of the interest for people in the room. So let me end there. Thank you.
I read an article that you wrote about Piketty's thesis about wealth being the driver of inequality. And I guess I'm curious if you could walk us through inequality and how these trends that you talk about are going to affect inequality. So so the questions I guess I have are: do you think that thesis applies to China, that wealth is a driver? And I think you do, but if so, how do these 2 trends that you mentioned of a slowing economic growth and rising age, how is that going to affect inequality in the future?
Thank you. Piketty was in Beijing last week. I think he was in Shanghai also. Piketty's main argument is that the return to capital is higher than the return, than the growth in the economy overall. So therefore, you have a increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of few. So this is his basic formula. Now, economic slowdown means more capital will be needed. So you just have to, when you put in 10 billion, what you could produce used to be with 10 billion US dollars, now you probably need 100 billion. So there will be a slower economic growth will drive up demand for capital. Okay, so that everything else being equal would bring a higher, it's not a higher return for capital in contrast to what capital used to get, but higher return to capital in contrast to the overall economic growth rate. So economic growth rate is going to go down, but the demand for capital, because of the slower growth, would increase. Now, aging plays a very important role here. I think Piketty wrote a lot about aging. He didn't write much about China. He wrote a lot about aging. How aging population would put in more money into the capital, and how they would also drive up basically they would demand for higher return. Well, I think for people who are above a certain age, we would like to see your pension fund get a better return, right, with aging population. Now, in the Chinese case, there was a special twist, which I wrote, is that it's going to further increase not just the overall inequality. Okay, if capital return is going to be higher than economic overall growth, you're going to see a worsening trend of inequality. But in the Chinese case, is the wealth concentration takes place among the families with the smallest number of children. That is, the urban population, many of them have only one child. So you're really seeing how the wealth is going down towards a smaller number of people. And that could also drive up inequality, like say, between urban and rural families, children of urban and family backgrounds. So everything else being equal. Right? Thank you.
Did the one-child policy undoubtedly do what it was meant to do? Are there actually fewer children today than there would have been if everyone was left to their own devices? Or is it impossible to tell? And then I had a follow-up.
Of course. I think in 6 months, I'll be able to send you a paper that kind of more fully answer your question, but I can certainly give you some answer right now. We just finished a paper and sent it to a journal on the myth of the one-child policy. A number of things, I would say. Well, the one-child policy clearly created more only children families. There would have been more families that would have had 2 children or even more had there not been the one-child policy, right? However, history will, I think, remember that 70% of China's fertility decline up to date took place before the one-child policy was launched. Okay. So most of China's fertility decline occurred before 1980. 2, in the first decade of the one-child policy in the 1980s, fertility hardly went down further. 3, when fertility in China, the number of children per woman on average dropped to what demographers call the below replacement level. That's 2.1 children per couple. That began 20 years ago in the early 1990s, and that coincided with really the booming of the Chinese economy. So it's really, on the one hand, you would say the one-child policy resulted in a lot of excesses, but I can certainly say with a lot of confidence it played a very, very minor role in terms of birth control in China. Right. It was overkill.
Several people have observed that in the period when the one-child policy was most in effect and most effective, that China observed that also experienced a boom.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Was what mechanism? By what mechanism did fewer children contribute to greater income?
Okay, now there are 2 parts here. One is the when you look at the there are 2 parts here. One is there were fewer children in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s. So until now. So you could say that in the old thinking, that we have what's called the dependent population, the people who are in the very young age and people in old age. They depend on others to support them. So China had a decline continued decline in the number of young dependent population. But as I said early on, most of that happened before the one-child policy, not afterwards. But the other part really has nothing to do with the one-child policy. As I showed you, is really the historical congruence of people who were born after the people who were born in the mid 1980s, right? And the people born, or they are the children of those who were born after Chinese famine. There was a huge baby boom in the early 1960s. So the bulge we saw had nothing to do. That's absolute number. That's not percentage. So they had nothing to do with the one-child policy. And now we actually question the wisdom that these young dependents are actually draining resources, because I got a lot of calls from people in business in the last couple of years. They were all anxious to know what's going to happen with the relaxation of the one-child policy, whether the milk powder industry, the baby clothes industry could come into China. They want to really know it's going to be 2 million births or 5 million births. So in other words, you're looking at the economy where demand is driving the economy. So I think it's a complex story, but overall, I would say the one-child policy really had no meaningful contribution to China's economic boom.
Was there an aspect that with rapid industrialization and rapid increase in productivity or productive capacity, not labor productivity, that there would be a greater demand for the remaining workers, and therefore their incomes would rise because
Absolutely.
they would get a higher share of labor of total income?
Of course. Beginning about 10 years ago, when we, actually now we know the numbers well, when we start to see the shrinkage of young labor force, unskilled and semi-skilled labor cost or income has been going up double digit year after year. So that certainly helped the income of these migrants, laborers, right? But remember, this actually is a process that had occurred in the history of the United States as well, and in other parts. So it's not, you have this process of industrialization, urbanization, migration, rising cost of labor, rising income, and the convergence of urban-rural income. So that happened in other societies as well.
I'm curious about the trends that you described for the aging of the population, which obviously is not a formula for robust growth. Yet we keep hearing about the likelihood that the middle class is going to grow and consumption consumption is going to grow and become a bigger part of the Chinese economy. Is that because these factors, the increased education, will outweigh the aging of the population, and therefore will help drive and accelerate consumption in the Chinese economy?
I would not use the word outweigh. I would use the word compensate.
Okay.
Or offset somewhat. Indeed, I have other figures which I can convey verbally. Two interesting patterns. When you look at the income profile by age, in the U.S., I would say the peak is like in the 40s, early 40s. You have this almost like a bell-shaped income profile, as with age and with your income. It goes up and then comes down. In the Chinese case, it's left tilted. So the peak is not in the 40s, it's in early 30s. And that's a combination of the changing educational composition of the labor force. These people are doing very different kind of work compared with, and that has something to do with migration, rural population, young labor move into the cities, they make a lot more. But what's interesting, we have data we just looked at 2 weeks ago, between 2007 and 2009, the consumption of the young people has come up. So really the generation that's born in the 1990s or in the late 1980s are quite different from their parents. They do spend They spend their own money. They spend their parents' money. A lot of them spend their parents' money. So you actually see a noticeable shift just in a short time period. This is a fun thing to do social science research in China. You actually see things that change even between 2 years, right? So so the consumption is different. But the size of the elderly population and the size of these groups, they're not comparable. And so consumption will certainly change. But I don't have the exact calculation. I don't know who can do this kind of calculation, whether the savings or the lack of the low consumption of the elderly population can really be outweighed or compensated by the rising consumption of the younger population. I think both are working, and also you look at what they consume. The elderly, they spend more money on medicine than on food, right?
That's one thing I was interested in, your thoughts about American companies that may be poised to take advantage of the aging population in a variety of ways, whether it's senior housing or healthcare. Are you seeing companies kind of scouting out opportunities over in China?
Pharmaceutical companies are the biggest money makers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They all come to China. I mean, this is it's right.
Can China afford the level of pharmaceutical consumption that developed countries have?
Well, this is something. There are a lot of things that people have to tell them not to do or do, but this is one thing. Taking care of their health is not something that people need to be convinced. So to the extent that they can, they will. I mean, people will try every means to save and to divert income to preserve their health.
Right.
So they're going to spend, right? The one issue, though, is I don't know whether anyone has looked into this in depth, is the healthcare sector. We're talking about Obamacare in the United States. Is how messy, how politicized. You come to China to look at the healthcare sector. It's a much bigger headache. It's very, very hard. You can do a lot of businesses in China, but it's really, really hard to get into two sectors, education and healthcare. And these are the two worst sectors in China. The government pays 10% of the cost for hospitals. I think 10% of hospital income revenue comes from the government. But because of the 10%, just like University of California, we get 25% from the state legislature, and then we are considered public university. So there's a lot of things you cannot do. You cannot raise your tuition. You cannot raise your fees. So because of the 10% input from the public coffer, these hospitals are Chinese hospitals are considered public hospitals. So the price system is totally distorted, right? And generates a lot of tremendous inefficiency and corruption, right? It's really hard to get in, and it really affects the health care delivery. So this is really one of the huge challenges China has. You want to do the reforms when you have the resources, when the aging tsunami is not here. But China has really dragged on its feet because of, I think in every society they consider healthcare not just as a private sector, as a public service sector.
When you refer to education, you mean higher ed? When you talk about education, healthcare being the two hardest.
I think all levels. Now there are, in Shanghai there are American schools and private schools, but if you want to get into the Chinese higher education system later on, you have to use their textbooks. You have to use, have their curriculum, right?
Well, let me ask you this then, because a lot been. Just look at this graph alone, right? A lot has been made of the investments in higher education,
right?
The number of PhDs coming out. But my question is, what about the quality that's coming out of it? the fact that a lot of people still send their kids overseas
Right.
to get educated, and if you're telling me that education, healthcare are the hardest to get into, and they also happen to be kind of the worst type of quality,
Sectors,
then how
right.
much should we hold stock in these numbers or the number of PhDs or engineers are coming out of Chinese universities?
Well, I just have to say it's getting better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what you can always say. That is why in a place like Fudan University, I mean, in all top universities, the best students are undergraduate students. And many of them, most of them don't stay here for graduate schools. They go abroad, they go to the United States. Investment comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And I think quality increase comes later, but gradually. So I can say it's better than before,
Mhm.
but it's still not quite there, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm curious how, when we're talking all about demographics, we haven't talked yet about immigration, and I'm sorry for asking the question again, but I didn't get an answer last time. So I'm curious what you think about ways in which immigration out of China, be it a brain drain if you think there is one at all, I mean for PhD students, or if they come back, maybe that's not an issue, but even talking about, Americans have started to pay attention to the issue of migration to Africa and that sort of thing. I know that even if there's 1 million Chinese people living in Africa, that's still a very, very small part of the Chinese population that actually moved there, but what effect, if any, is immigration having on the economy back home in China, on incomes, on income inequality, if it's certain types of people who are immigrating and generating money or not? What's the impact of immigration on all these other sort of demographic trends?
Well, I have to give you a biased, non-scientific answer because I lived many years abroad, so I think I actually, by my going abroad, China actually benefited. Right, the kind of research that I've done, I would not have been able to do in China. But now, I think to China's credit, that they have these programs that would allow people like myself to work here. Right, they've launched a lot of different programs that allow people to make it easier for people to come to China to live. I have a Chinese green card, so that certainly helps with my exit and entry. And
How do you divide your time? Do you
about
go
half and
places
half.
equally?
Yeah, about half. Here, slightly more now. But I think given the size of China, the brain drain may not be a terrible issue because that just opens up more opportunity for other people, and the bridges, the networks set up by these overseas Chinese, we know for a fact actually, in terms of there were books written about China's early economic growth, foreign investment. The book by Yasheng Huang, who was at MIT, who wrote foreign investment in China. The majority of the investment actually came from people from Taiwan, Hong Kong. They have not just money but ties, human ties. They brought in the managerial know-how, and that's what happened with the early stage of Chinese economic takeoff. So that we know actually for sure. But there's no overall general study of what's the net gain or net loss. My biased view is China has not lost to this, and a lot of technology, let's say, grow out of the Silicon Valley, and they get imported back to China.
But what about on the issue of the inequalities? If you look at the broad scope of all Chinese of all sorts, not just intellectuals or people in education, but people just doing small business in developing countries. If you take all the Chinese abroad, is that exacerbating or not inequality? What's your sense? Are there more wealthy Chinese in general who are going abroad and therefore receiving new opportunities and having more money back home in China? I mean, what do you think there's any impact on inequalities because of who is going abroad overall?
I think in the short run, you see the privileged families, the privileged segment of the population, Now their children, they can have anything they want, and if they can't tough it out in the Chinese super competitive educational system, they have other ways. So in the short run, you see, okay, these people, they have money, they can do anything. But in the long run, I think as long as within China, the social mobility system is open, then that just opens up opportunity for other people. So it does not, in the long run, it does not affect equality or inequality because these people will be abroad. And the fact is, you've seen, I mean, you hear a lot of stories of spoiled kids or not hardworking kids of the second, third generation. They just go abroad, they, just spend money, live off their parents' wealth. They just kind of spend down the wealth. They can help with reducing inequality. I'll tell you. Back in June last year, I had a school counselor at UC Irvine who, in my school, came to me and said, Professor Wang Feng, we really need you to help us to understand how to work with these Chinese, these foreign students from China. I said, what? I said, well, academic dishonesty and so on and so forth, because it's a different culture. I mean, here certain things is considered acceptable. It's not to say these kids are, bad or whatever. But the problem they faced was there was a student who was caught cheating twice, and then the parents of the kid hired lawyers to come to the school. I mean, the university has never encountered someone who would bring a lawyer to protect their the university does not want to go to court, right? It costs us money, but here you have a kid who, right? Yeah, but the parents, they have money, they don't know what to do with this, so the natural thing is just let's hire some professional. And the irony is the lawyer is an intellectual property expert. you have to be in that discipline. Otherwise, how do you argue, right? Whether the cheating is within the boundary, how do you punish the kid? So I didn't follow up with what happened. But this is what happened with the parents, with the kid. So they don't necessarily get ahead.
So you have Chinese helicopter parents too.
It's more than a helicopter.
Jet bomber.
Hovercraft.
I have a kind of an off-the-wall question, but I have you here, so I have to ask you. I've always wondered what there was a time in the United States when only children were considered overachievers.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of the first 12 astronauts were all only children.
Oh, really?
There's some and a lot of presidents, things like that. Has anyone studied, or have you studied the impact of having a nation or a whole generation of only children?
Yes and no. Let me put a no first. The one-child policy was first and foremost implemented in urban areas, in the cities. So in a scientific study, you want to have controls. Controls meaning that the two groups are identical in every aspect, except there's one feature, that is only child versus non-only child. Now, because the people in the countryside were allowed to have two children, some of them, and so when you compare the only child and the non-only child, you don't have a control group in cities. So that's the hard part. So in most part, we don't, there are very few, almost no study. Now, the exception was a paper that was published last year in Science magazine by a group of Australian scholars who surveyed people born in the early 1980s and late 1970s. So there were still people who had siblings. And I don't exactly remember all the details. I think there were 6 psychological traits, like generosity, and the other, factors. I think in 3 of those or 4 of those, the only children do less well. So that is one of the exceptions of the studies that I've seen. So you could, look that up. But my kind of intuitive sense is that I'm surrounded by only children in China, and I would say they certainly would miss certain kind of experiences, but because both their children and then themselves really want to be full citizens, full human beings, I'm not too concerned about the psychological aspects of the only children. And what I think would happen for sure is really when you need to take care of these only children, when they need to take care of their aging parents, when they need to discuss things like at the last stage of their parents' lives, and when they don't have someone to help out. And that is a hard reality. I've experienced that. I have one sister, older sister. So when my mother was ill and was at the end of her life a couple of years ago, having that sibling is so important. I mean, it's different from your spouse, different from your son, because the sibling is really different. So that I think the number is humongous. China has 150 million only children. It's 1 in 3 families right now. And so as a collective human experience, we've never seen this in history.
Thank you, Professor Wang.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.